I speak 9 languages. The phrase shot out like lightning from the mouth of a Muslim girl who was only 12 years old. The entire room froze. Executives stopped breathing, and even the constant hum of the air conditioning seemed to cease for an instant. Across the table, Richard Miller, the atheist millionaire known for his open contempt for faith and the poor, burst into laughter. His laugh echoed like cruel thunder within the marble walls of the 27th floor. To him, this was a joke, a janitor's daughter daring to claim something that even his gold-priced translators couldn't accomplish. But Amina didn't tremble. Her eyes remained steady, like someone who carried a certainty greater than any wealth. And Richard, still unaware, was about to face something his money could never buy, the innocent yet relentless wisdom of a girl who would change the course of his life forever. Before continuing with this story, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far this account can reach. Richard Miller's office was more than a workplace. It was a monument to his ego. Located on the 27th floor of one of Kuala Lumpur's most imposing towers, the space reflected every inch of his obsession with power. The walls were covered with marble imported from Italy, and each piece of art cost more than the combined salaries of 100 employees. An enormous Swiss watch gleamed on his wrist, acquired for $150,000, not for taste, but for the pleasure of showing off. From the glass ceiling, the city stretched beneath his feet like a board of ants. For Richard, this view wasn't just panoramic. It was a daily reminder that he was above everyone, socially, financially, and morally. He didn't see streets full of ordinary people. He saw a sea of insignificance. At 52 years old, Richard carried the pride of being a convinced atheist. To him, faith was a collective delusion, a consolation of the weak. In his inner circle, he liked to repeat that religion was just the crutch of the defeated. And every time he said this, he felt the weight of his dominion increase, because he saw in his subordinates' eyes the fear of disagreeing. On that particular morning, while adjusting his silk tie and observing his perfect reflection in the mirrored glass, Richard wasn't thinking about contracts or business strategies. His greatest pleasure was the anticipation of another humiliation. He was determined to turn the janitor's and her daughter's arrival into a spectacle of contempt. The stage was set: excess luxury, an audience of submissive executives, and a tyrant ready to display his cruelty. He still didn't know, but this would be the day when the stage of arrogance would transform into a tribunal, and the judge would be someone he would never consider worthy of confronting him. The door opened without fanfare, and the sound of cleaning cart wheels broke the rigid atmosphere of the environment. Aisha entered with contained steps, wearing her simple blue uniform. Her posture betrayed years of submission, head slightly bowed, eyes lowered, as if the world had taught her that the best path was to be invisible. Behind her came Amina, her 12-year-old daughter. The contrast was striking. While the mother carried the weight of routine, Amina displayed large, attentive eyes, full of a curiosity that not even poverty had managed to extinguish. She carried a worn backpack, sewn with patches, but from inside came books borrowed from the municipal library, organized carefully as if they were treasures. Richard observed the scene with contempt. To him, they were just 2 figures destined to serve him. However, at that instant his twisted mind was already plotting the fun he would have. He smiled sideways, like someone who senses a perverse game about to begin. The executives present looked away. Some felt discomfort at the imminent humiliation, but none dared intervene. Everyone knew the pleasure Richard took in trampling others' dignity, and they knew that any gesture of compassion could cost them their jobs. The silent entrance of mother and daughter seemed insignificant, but carried within it a force that no one, except God, was capable of seeing. Aisha just wanted to finish her task and leave in peace. Amina, however, carried something much greater in her heart, a fire of dignity that would soon ignite the pride of the most arrogant man in the room. Richard didn't waste time. While Aisha began preparing her cleaning materials, he rose behind the marble table and pulled out a stack of aged papers. They were yellowed pages, full of intricate symbols, written in classical Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit. "Look at this," he said with a venomous smile, raising the manuscript as if it were a relic. Not even doctors from the region's greatest universities could completely decipher it. And do you know why? Because it's impossible for common minds. The executives laughed, obedient to the boss's cruelty script. Richard then turned to Amina, who watched in silence, still standing behind her mother. "Girl, come here." His voice had the tone of a military order. "I want you to see this document. Maybe you can succeed where the doctors failed." The entire room held back laughter. It was an obvious trap, placing a 12-year-old child before a challenge that even specialists had declared impossible. For Richard, it would be the height of fun, proving publicly that intelligence wasn't born in poor families. He pushed the papers toward the girl, like someone throwing a bone to a dog. Contempt dripped from his face. He was certain the girl would lower her head, embarrassed, confirming his cruel theory. What Richard couldn't imagine was that this challenge, created to humiliate, would be exactly the stage of his own ruin. Everyone awaited the predictable. The girl would remain silent, blush, maybe even cry. Laughter was already beginning to form in some executives' throats, anxious to accompany the spectacle. But Amina didn't look away. She held the papers delicately, like someone who recognizes the value of something ancient. Her eyes ran over the lines, and instead of fear, there was genuine curiosity. Then she raised her head, and with a calm and firm voice returned the question. "Can you read it, sir?" Silence fell over the room like a blade. Richard, who was already preparing to laugh, choked. Air escaped him for an instant. No one had ever dared confront him in public, much less a janitor's daughter. The expected laughter transformed into discomfort. Executives looked at each other, unsure how to react. Aisha, motionless, felt her heart race. The simple question from a child had exposed the fragility Richard hid behind his arrogance. He himself understood nothing of that document. In seconds, his absolute authority wavered. For the first time in many years, the atheist millionaire experienced the bitter taste of vulnerability, and he still didn't know that this was just the first crack in an empire of pride that was about to crumble. Richard still tried to recover his composure after the girl's unexpected question. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, forced a smile, certain he could regain control of the situation. But before he could react, Amina raised her face and with disconcerting calm began to speak. "I speak Portuguese," she said with firm pronunciation. "Also English, Spanish, French, Italian, German, Mandarin, Arabic and Russian. 9 languages." She didn't shout, didn't make a point of showing off. She enumerated each language as if she were just listing the books she had read that week. But the impact was devastating. Each word, each language, pierced Richard's chest like sharp blades, tearing his pride apart in front of the audience. The room, accustomed to the forced laughter that followed the boss's cruel jokes, plunged into absolute silence. The executives looked at each other, unable to hide their surprise. Rosa, the mother, widened her eyes, astonished. She herself didn't know her daughter had accumulated so much knowledge, hidden among books and free classes at the library. Richard felt blood boil in his face. For a moment he was speechless. A child, daughter of a janitor, had just exposed before everyone the emptiness of his arrogance. The man who always used power to reduce others to nothing was, for the first time, being diminished by something money couldn't buy. True intelligence, built on discipline and humility. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak, almost suffocated. His mind desperately sought a way to recover the position of dominance, but each of the 9 languages echoed like a hammer, reminding him that, despite his billions, he didn't master any of them. The silence in the room prolonged, heavy as lead. Amina, however, didn't seem intimidated. She took the manuscript carefully, like someone holding a sacred object. Her eyes scanned the lines scribbled in classical Arabic, and without hesitating, her voice began to sound. The first words flowed smoothly, but loaded with authority. The ancient Arabic came from her mouth with a perfection that made even the executives, who understood nothing, recognize they were before something extraordinary. It wasn't just impeccable pronunciation. There was intonation, musicality, reverence. Richard, accustomed to ridiculing Muslims in private conversations, felt his heart accelerate. The sound coming from that girl was different from anything he had ever heard. It wasn't simple reading. It was as if history itself was coming to life before them. The convinced atheist tried to hold on, but realized something inside him was moving. A deep discomfort, a strange sensation of witnessing the impossible. How could a girl of only 12 years dominate with such naturalness a language that even academics avoided risking to recite? Executives who minutes before laughed discreetly now remained motionless, as if they feared breaking the spell. Rosa brought her hands to her face, tears already flowing, unable to believe what she witnessed. Each verse read by Amina seemed to open cracks in the armor Richard had built during decades of skepticism and arrogance. For the first time in many years, The millionaire couldn't laugh. He felt small before something he didn't understand, but that spoke directly to his heart. When she finished the first passage, Amina raised her eyes and, with the same serenity, translated to Portuguese. This text says that true wealth is not in money, but in the dignity with which we treat each human being. The words, simple and direct, exploded in the air like a sentence. The executives, who held their breath, felt a collective shiver. It was as if the manuscript had crossed centuries just to be revealed at that moment in that room. Richard, who had always sustained his empire on the humiliation of others, was hit as if he had taken a punch to the stomach. The arrogance that kept him upright seemed to crumble. For the first time in decades, he lowered his eyes. The phrase continued echoing inside him. True wealth is not money, but dignity. Everything in his life had been built on the contrary idea. That money bought respect, power, and even identity. But now, before a girl who possessed nothing beyond her faith and brilliant mind, Richard perceived the bankruptcy of his own philosophy. Rosa sobbed softly. For her, each word from her daughter was more than pride. It was confirmation that Allah had given her girl a voice capable of lifting the humiliated and silencing the oppressors. The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared move, because everyone knew something greater was happening there. It wasn't just a manuscript being translated. It was the fall of an empire of pride before innocence and truth. The room was still plunged in a strange silence. It was a heavy, dense silence that seemed to carry centuries of hidden truths, finally unveiled by unlikely lips. Richard Miller, the atheist millionaire who took such pride in ridiculing any sign of faith, breathed with difficulty. His chest heaved as if he had run a marathon, although he remained seated in his leather chair. Amina, on the other hand, was serene. She held the ancient manuscript as if it were a natural extension of her own thoughts. There was something in her posture that didn't match her age. Her large dark eyes, full of light, seemed to carry an authority that didn't come from titles, diplomas, or fortune, but from something greater, invisible, that transcended any human logic. She then took a deep breath, and without any warning, her voice began to echo in classical Arabic. يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذَانَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَالَّذَانَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَةٍ وَاللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. The verses flowed with such perfect cadence that even those who didn't understand Arabic felt the force of the words pierce their bones. It was as if each syllable had weight, as if the room's air had changed density. The girl's pronunciation was impeccable, but more than that, there was deep emotion in each intonation and almost palpable respect. Richard trembled. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the force. It was as if something inside him, something he had buried decades ago under layers of skepticism and pride, had suddenly awakened. Amina paused, and looking directly into the billionaire's eyes, translated, Allah elevates in degrees those who believe and those who receive knowledge, and Allah is fully aware of what you do. The words hit Richard like a hammer. He had always believed that knowledge was his fortress, the pillar that sustained his empire. He knew about numbers, knew about business, knew how to manipulate people and markets. But before that girl, he realized that what he called wisdom was, in truth, just a collection of strategies to accumulate wealth. There was no transcendence, no greater purpose. A shiver ran down his spine. For the first time in decades, he felt fear, but it wasn't fear of losing money, status, or power. It was fear of something much deeper, fear of having lived until then completely blind to what really mattered. Amina continued reciting. Her voice didn't tremble. Her breathing was measured. Each verse that came from her mouth seemed to expose layers of falseness that Richard had accumulated like armor over the years. The arrogance that once filled his every gesture was slowly evaporating, like smoke before the wind. Rosa, the mother, couldn't contain her tears. Her shoulders trembled discreetly, but in her eyes shone something she had never before dared dream of witnessing. Her daughter, there, before powerful men, not just confronting them, but revealing to them the majesty of Allah. The executives remained motionless. Some, uncomfortable, avoided looking at Richard. Others, fascinated, couldn't tear their eyes away from the girl. The atmosphere had completely transformed. It was no longer a business meeting, no longer a humiliation game. It was a spiritual moment, almost liturgical, where faith manifested as living force. And then, it happened. Richard felt a tear roll down the corner of his eye. He tried to disguise it, quickly wiping with his fingers, but the second came, then the third. Before he realized it, he was crying in front of everyone. He, the man who had built an entire reputation on the idea of invulnerability, the atheist who mocked any religion, was being broken by words recited by a child. It was a new and unbearable sensation. At the same time he wanted to get up and shout to interrupt that, he felt he couldn't. It was as if he were paralyzed, forced to listen to a truth he had always rejected. "My daughter," Rosa tried to whisper, but her choked voice didn't pass her throat. Amina, without taking her eyes off Richard, finished another passage. وَمَنْ يُعَزِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. And again translated, "Those who honor the symbols of Allah, that is the sign of the righteousness of hearts." The words fell on Richard like a sentence. For the first time, he felt shame not for what he possessed, but for what he lacked. Shame for having ridiculed believers, for having insulted Muslims in private conversations, for having used his wealth as a shield against any spiritual reflection. There, in front of a 12-year-old girl, he realized his entire life was a castle of sand. He could have billions, but he didn't have peace. He could have power, but he didn't have purpose. He could have market knowledge, but he didn't have real wisdom. The convinced atheist was being disarmed, not by intellectual arguments, but by the purity of a faith lived with authenticity. A faith that didn't need palaces nor fortune, but that flourished even in the life of a janitor's daughter. Richard lowered his eyes. His shoulders, once erect and arrogant, were now curved. His voice, which had so often silenced others, couldn't come out. He was reduced to silence, not by imposition, but by impotence. And at that instant, a frightening thought crossed his mind. What if I've been wrong my entire life? This thought pierced him like a blade. It wasn't just doubt about God's existence. It was recognition that his entire life could have been built on a lie. The lie that money was everything, that faith was nothing, that dignity could be bought or discarded. Amina then closed the manuscript. Her eyes remained fixed on the man before her, but her voice softened. "You always believed that power was in humiliating, but true power is in elevating." Richard felt the world spin. He didn't know if it was emotion, shame, or something deeper. But for the first time he wanted to ask. He wanted to know. He wanted to understand. And while tears flowed freely, the phrase echoed inside him like an inevitable sentence. Allah elevates in degrees those who believe and those who receive knowledge. The faith he had so despised now rose before him like a wall impossible to ignore. And Richard Miller, the atheist millionaire, began to realize he might be facing the most decisive moment of his entire existence. Richard Miller had never felt what was happening at that instant. The man accustomed to giving orders, manipulating markets, treating people like disposable pieces, was now before a 12-year-old girl feeling small, naked, disarmed. The words recited in Arabic still echoed in his mind like thunder. He didn't understand the language, but his heart understood. It was as if each verse had pierced the armor he had built over decades of militant atheism. For the first time in his life, Richard experienced something he couldn't control, truth that didn't depend on his approval. He tried to raise his eyes, but couldn't sustain the girl's steady gaze. It was like looking into a mirror, but a mirror that reflected not his successful image, but his moral bankruptcy. He saw a man who had spent billions to build towers, but who had no peace on his pillow. He saw someone who had always prided himself on humiliating others, but who was now being crushed by a humility impossible to buy. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice choked as if swallowing stones. Amina didn't hesitate. She straightened her fragile shoulders and replied, "I am just a servant of Allah. I am the daughter of Rosa Aisha, who has cleaned your offices for 6 years. But I am also someone who knows that knowledge is a light. And light doesn't come from wealth, it comes from God." Those words hit Richard like a sentence. The faith he had always treated as superstition was now before him, alive, breathing, speaking 9 languages, with an authority that challenged his pride. The executives looked at each other. The embarrassment in the air was almost palpable. Some seemed not to believe what they saw. The most arrogant man in Malaysia being confronted and silenced by a girl with a patched backpack. Richard, feeling the weight of shame and revelation, let escape what he never thought he would say before witnesses. "Teach me." The phrase came out low, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to transform the environment. Rosa brought her hands to her face, tears flowing like rivers. Amina took a deep breath. There was no arrogance in her response, just serenity. "I am not a teacher, but I can show you the way." Richard swallowed hard. For the first time, he wasn't speaking as a boss nor as a millionaire. He was speaking as a desperate man. "Where do I find this way?" Amina closed her eyes for a moment. and then recited again in Arabic, Ihdina sirat al-mustaqam, sirat al-ladha'na an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallan. Richard trembled. The girl's voice seemed to fill the space, tear down the marble walls, invade the cracks of his soul. This is the supplication every Muslim makes. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those who were blessed, not of those who went astray. Richard couldn't contain his tears. Never in 52 years of life had he made a sincere prayer. Never had he asked for something beyond himself. But at that moment, he understood he was before the chance of his life. Not a contract, not a business deal, but the opportunity to finally know the truth. Amina then closed the manuscript and said firmly, "The money you have can buy houses, cars, power. But it cannot buy peace. It cannot buy forgiveness. It cannot buy eternity. For that there is only one way: submit to Allah." Richard fell to his knees. The marble floor that had so often symbolized his power now became an improvised altar for his surrender. The executives watched in shock, unable to process the scene. Rosa, sobbing, approached her daughter and embraced her, feeling she was witnessing a miracle. "I don't know how to pray," confessed Richard, looking at the two. "But I want to learn. I want to know this God you serve." Amina knelt beside him. She placed her small hand on the table and said with a firmness that seemed to come from centuries of wisdom, "Then repeat after me." And there, in the heart of a luxury tower in Kuala Lumpur, before incredulous executives and the humble mother who had only come to work, Richard Miller pronounced Allah's name for the first time. The man who laughed at faith now confessed in tears that he needed to be guided. The silence after those words was absolute, a silence so profound it seemed more eloquent than any speech. Richard, on his knees, breathed with difficulty. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was the weight of an entire life being crushed by the awakening of an instant. The executives remained paralyzed. No one dared interrupt. Some lowered their eyes in respect. Others just stared at the scene as if they were before an invisible tribunal. Rosa, crying, held her daughter's hand firmly, unable to believe what she witnessed. Richard raised his gaze to Amina. There was no more arrogance, no more sarcasm, just a raw, exposed, almost childlike vulnerability. "I spent my entire life thinking wealth was power, but now I see I spent my life poor. You had what I never had: faith, dignity, hope." Amina smiled gently, a smile that mixed innocence and wisdom. "Allah changes hearts, Mr. Richard. Today, he decided to change yours." The words echoed like prophecy. Richard stood up slowly. He was no longer the same man. His posture was no longer that of a tyrant, but of a learner. The luxurious office seemed smaller, the artwork seemed empty. The watches and expensive objects no longer had the same shine. For the first time he saw all of that as it really was: dust. He looked at Rosa, and for the first time in 6 years of coexistence, called her by name. "Rosa, forgive me." She couldn't contain her tears. The millionaire, who had never even acknowledged her existence, was now asking forgiveness before everyone. It was the complete miracle, not just a conversion, but the restoration of dignity. That day, the man who laughed at faith began walking toward Islam. A year later, already converted, he would finance education programs in mosques and public libraries, helping thousands of children like Amina have access to knowledge. His empire, once a symbol of arrogance, transformed into a bridge for opportunities. And it had all begun with a simple phrase said by a 12-year-old Muslim girl: "I speak 9 languages." If this story reached you today, it wasn't by chance. Share this video in groups and social networks. Who knows how many Richards still need to hear that true wealth is not in money, but in Allah, and that a child's faith can change eternal destinies.